They thought Africa could be silenced with money. They thought dignity could be traded like a business deal. But what happened in Burkina Faso proved them wrong, and it is shaking the entire world. 3 weeks ago, a confidential proposal arrived in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso. On the surface, it looked like diplomatic correspondence. But inside, it was something much darker. A foreign government, backed by powerful lobbies, had offered billions of dollars to President Ibrahim Traore. Their demand? Silence, obedience, and protection for their business empire spread across Africa. But it was not development aid. It was not investment. It was nothing less than a bribe. The letter promised unimaginable sums, money that could build new highways, modern hospitals, and military bases. More money than Burkina Faso's national budget itself. But hidden behind those promises was the real cost. They wanted Traoré to soften his criticism of their policies in the Middle East. They wanted him to persuade other African leaders to step back from defending Palestine. They wanted him to act like their representative inside the African Union. And there was more. They demanded unrestricted access to continue running their networks of businesses in Africa, businesses accused of draining resources, exploiting workers, and transferring wealth out of the continent. In exchange, they promised additional compensation worth billions. For the senders of this letter, it was a simple equation: money in exchange for silence, money in exchange for protection, money in exchange for dignity. But they had underestimated the man they were dealing with. Ibrahim Traore is not just another politician sitting comfortably in office. He is a soldier forged in battle, a leader who rose to power after standing up against corruption and foreign exploitation. He did not risk his life to overthrow a broken system just to become another puppet in the hands of outsiders. When he read that letter, Traoré understood immediately what it meant. It was a test of whether his promises to the people of Burkina Faso were real or just empty slogans, a test of whether Africa's sovereignty had a price tag. And so, instead of replying in secret, instead of negotiating behind closed doors, Traoré chose a path that no one expected. He called a press conference and placed that letter before the world. He read it aloud, word for word, on live television. He exposed the attempt to buy his silence and to buy Africa's future. The room went silent. Journalists who had covered Africa for decades said they had never seen anything like it. A leader openly rejecting billions in bribes and choosing dignity instead. Within hours, news spread like wildfire. Hashtags like #AfricaNotForSale and #TraoreSpeaksTruth began trending across the continent. From the streets of Bamako to the universities of Nairobi, young Africans were sharing the video of his speech. The reactions were immediate and powerful. Mali announced a review of its foreign contracts. Niger pulled back its ambassador from Tel Aviv. Ghana, usually careful to avoid controversy, expressed open support. South Africa's government praised Burkina Faso's courage, calling it a turning point for African leadership. But the most important reaction came from the youth. Students across West Africa organized rallies. In Senegal, artists painted murals of Traoré, holding up the infamous letter. In Kenya, campaigns were launched demanding transparency in all government deals. University campuses from Cairo to Cape Town erupted in debates about sovereignty, dignity, and Africa's future. For the first time in years, young Africans felt they were part of something historic. They called themselves the uncompromised generation. Their demand was clear: no more secret deals, no more selling Africa's dignity, no more silence in the face of exploitation. And as their voices grew louder, the foreign powers who had tried to buy silence realized their mistake. What was meant to be a private arrangement had exploded into a continental awakening. The ripple effects were being felt across international capitals. Tel Aviv went into damage control. Paris scrambled to protect its interests. Washington tried to measure the long-term impact. But the truth was already clear. The old playbook no longer worked. Africa was no longer a silent marketplace to be exploited in the shadows. It was a continent ready to stand tall, united, and uncompromised. And this was just the beginning. The moment that letter was read aloud, the world changed for Burkina Faso and for Africa. What was meant to remain hidden in locked drawers of diplomacy had been laid bare under the sunlight of truth. The reaction in Tel Aviv was one of panic. Reports say senior officials held emergency meetings that lasted through the night. Their carefully crafted networks across Africa, business deals, mining rights, political influence, suddenly felt fragile. One soldier's refusal had exposed years of manipulation, but the shockwaves weren't limited to Israel. In Paris, the foreign ministry was furious. How could Burkina Faso embarrass one of their strongest allies so openly? In Washington, policymakers debated whether Traoré's defiance was an isolated act or the beginning of something much larger. And in Beijing, there was silence, calculated silence. They knew that if Africa united under the banner of dignity, the balance of global power could shift forever. Inside Burkina Faso, the atmosphere was electric. On the streets of Ouagadougou, ordinary people celebrated. Vendors who sold roasted corn on the roadside spoke with pride about their president standing up for Africa. University students replayed the press conference on their phones, sharing clips with captions like, "Finally, a leader who cannot be bought." Even farmers in rural villages, who rarely followed international politics, heard the news on radio stations and nodded in agreement. Dignity mattered more than money, but not everyone was celebrating. Within hours of the broadcast, Traoré's security advisors reported unusual activity. Foreign intelligence agents had been spotted moving in and out of neighboring countries. Rumors spread that certain powerful governments were considering ways to pressure Burkina Faso, economically, diplomatically, even militarily. The pressure began subtly. Aid packages were suddenly delayed. Banking transactions became complicated. Trade routes faced unexpected blockages. It was the same old game, punish the defiant until they submit, yet something unexpected happened. Other African nations stepped forward. Nigeria proposed new trade agreements to keep Burkina Faso's market stable. Ghana offered alternative banking systems. South Africa quietly opened diplomatic channels, promising support if international sanctions escalated. Instead of isolation, Burkina Faso discovered something revolutionary: Africa helping Africa works. This new wave of solidarity was not built on contracts or conditions. It was built on a shared understanding, an understanding that Africa's strength lay in unity, not dependency. 3 days after the press conference, President Traoré traveled to Bobo Dioulasso to address university students. There was no red carpet, no military parade, just an open auditorium packed with thousands of young Africans eager to hear the man who had shaken the world. The energy in that hall was unlike anything seen before. Students waved handwritten banners, "We are not for sale," and "Africa rises with dignity." When Traoré walked onto the stage, the cheers were deafening. He raised his hand for silence and began to speak, not with prepared notes, but from the heart. For decades, he said, we were told to remain silent, to accept whatever scraps were given to us, to be grateful when we were ignored, and obedient when our dignity was trampled. But now look around you. They come to us not out of generosity, but out of fear, fear of what happens when Africa wakes up. The crowd erupted. Students clapped, shouted, and some wept. But Traoré pressed on. "Today, I ask you one question," he said. "Shall we return to silence, or shall we speak louder?" The answer was a roar so powerful that the walls trembled. Thousands of voices shouted as one, "Louder." That was the moment a movement was born. The students began calling themselves the uncompromised generation. They vowed to demand transparency from every leader, accountability in every deal, and dignity in every international relationship. For them, this was no longer just about Burkina Faso. This was about Africa's future. But Traoré knew words alone were not enough. The youth wanted action, a blueprint for independence. And so he laid out a vision: audit every foreign contract, demand clarity in every aid deal, prioritize trade with African nations before looking overseas, stop exporting raw materials cheaply. Instead, build factories and create industries. Invest in African banks, African universities, African technology hubs, support African artists, African farmers, African innovators. With every point, the applause grew louder, until the hall was filled with a thunderous rhythm of hands and voices chanting, "Africa, Africa, Africa." It was no longer just a speech. It was a manifesto, a roadmap for breaking the psychological chains of dependency that had shackled Africa for generations. But the foreign powers watching from afar were unsettled. They had always relied on Africa being divided, on leaders competing for favors, on populations remaining silent. What Traoré had unleashed was unity, and unity was their greatest fear. The Western media tried to spin the story. Headlines read, "Burkina Faso risks isolation," or "Traoré escalates tensions." But Africans saw through the propaganda. They understood that isolation from exploiters was not weakness, it was strength. By the end of the week, 5 other African presidents had personally called Traoré. Not through diplomats, but directly. Their question was the same: how do we do what you did? His answer was simple: stop being afraid. And that was the hardest part. For decades, African leaders had been conditioned to fear. Fear of losing aid, fear of international backlash, fear of standing alone. But when Traoré stood firm, they realized something. They were not alone. What had begun as one letter of bribery had transformed into a continental awakening. A reminder that Africa's dignity was priceless, and that sovereignty was worth more than billions in foreign bribes. And this was only the second chapter of a story still unfolding. The foreign powers had expected Burkina Faso to bow under pressure. They thought that once aid was cut, once trade routes were disrupted, the government in Ouagadougou would bend and quietly return to business as usual. But this time, things were different. Instead of collapsing, Burkina Faso began to adapt. Farmers organized local markets where goods were traded directly without reliance on foreign corporations. Young entrepreneurs started small-scale factories to process cotton, cocoa, and gold locally rather than exporting raw materials. Women's cooperatives began producing basic medicines using traditional knowledge combined with modern science. The message was clear. If foreign governments wanted to close doors, Africa would build new ones. Meanwhile, across the continent, the spirit of defiance spread like wildfire. In Mali, street rallies carried giant banners of Traoré's face next to the words, "Integrity has no price." In Niger, students wrote songs celebrating his courage, and the melodies echoed through city streets. In Uganda, intellectuals held forums debating how to renegotiate foreign contracts. Even in countries that had previously been silent, something was shifting. Ghanaians on social media began demanding greater transparency about their mining deals. Tanzanians questioned why so much of their land was leased to foreign corporations. Nigerians, tired of oil wealth flowing out of the country, demanded stricter laws against corruption and exploitation. It was as if a single voice had unlocked thousands of others, but the backlash was intensifying too. Anonymous threats were reported against Traoré's ministers. Foreign-owned news outlets began publishing stories accusing him of endangering regional stability. Secret meetings were held in European capitals to discuss how to contain the wave of African unity before it spread further. And then came the most dangerous move yet, economic sabotage. Cargo ships carrying essential supplies to West Africa suddenly faced technical delays. International banks froze transactions linked to Burkina Faso's government. Foreign investors withdrew, hoping to trigger panic in the markets. For a moment, it seemed like the plan might work. Food prices began to rise. Ordinary citizens worried about shortages. Traders whispered about possible unrest, but instead of panicking, the people responded with resilience. Volunteers organized food distribution in villages. Farmers donated surplus crops to urban centers. Local engineers worked day and night to repair supply chains. Social media campaigns encouraged citizens to buy African, support African. What foreign powers had expected to be Burkina Faso's breaking point became its rallying point, and then came a symbolic moment that shocked the world. During a regional summit in Bamako, President Traoré took the stage before African leaders, journalists, and international observers. Standing tall, he held up a single loaf of bread baked in Burkina Faso. This, he declared, is what independence looks like. Flour from our fields, baked in our ovens, served on our tables. They told us without them, we could not survive. Yet here we are feeding ourselves. The day Africa stops believing the lie of dependency, that day Africa will truly be free. The audience erupted in applause. Some leaders nodded cautiously, others clapped with passion, but the youth watching online turned those words into a slogan: feed ourselves, free ourselves. Within hours, hashtags carrying that phrase flooded Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok across the continent. Videos of local farmers, bakers, and artisans proudly showing their products with the slogan went viral. It was no longer just politics. It had become a cultural revolution, but Traoré's stand was not without risk. International intelligence briefings leaked in the media suggested that certain powerful nations were considering regime change operations. The idea was simple. If Traoré could not be bought, he must be replaced. Burkina Faso's intelligence services warned him daily of plots, infiltrations, and bribery attempts targeting his closest allies. But his answer remained the same. If my silence can be bought, then my life is worthless. If my voice inspires Africa, then even my death will not silence the truth. These words spread across the continent like wildfire. They were printed on posters, painted on walls, and sung in protest chants. Traoré had become more than a president. He was now a symbol. Even African leaders who disagreed with his methods could not deny his impact. Quietly, some began renegotiating their own deals. Others strengthened ties with regional allies instead of Western capitals. For the first time in decades, Africa was beginning to imagine a future where decisions were made not in Paris, London, or Washington, but in Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Abuja. And then something unprecedented happened in the international arena at the United Nations. During a heated session, Burkina Faso's ambassador stood up and delivered a fiery speech. He accused powerful nations of exploiting Africa, of using aid as a weapon, and of trying to silence voices of dignity. His words echoed through the hall, and though many diplomats shifted uncomfortably, others applauded. For the first time, Africa was not just asking for respect, it was demanding it. In Washington, officials admitted privately that a new generation of African leadership had emerged, fearless, outspoken, and immune to traditional pressure. In Europe, debates broke out. Should they punish Traoré further, or attempt to rebuild relations with this new Africa? In the Middle East, governments realized that the silence they had hoped to buy was gone forever. And yet, amid all this, Traoré remained grounded. In his weekly addresses, he reminded his people, "This is not about me. This is not about one nation. This is about every African child who deserves a future built on dignity, not dependency." Those words struck deep, because everyone knew the struggle was far from over. The foreign powers were regrouping. Plans were being made. The pressure would not stop. But Africa was awake now. And once a people awaken, they cannot easily be put back to sleep. The story of one rejected bribe had become the story of an entire continent's rebirth, and the next chapter would test Africa like never before. The storm was reaching its peak. Every passing week, new challenges rose before Burkina Faso and its people. From foreign sanctions to hidden plots, from economic sabotage to disinformation campaigns, it seemed as though the entire weight of global power was pressing down on one small West African nation. But instead of breaking, the people of Burkina Faso became stronger. In the villages, elders reminded the youth of their ancestors who resisted colonization with nothing but courage and unity. In the cities, artists turned walls into canvases of freedom, painting murals of Ibrahim Traore alongside phrases like, "Africa will not kneel." Musicians composed songs that spread from radios to marketplaces, carrying the rhythm of resistance in every beat. And as culture embraced the message of sovereignty, politics followed. Burkina Faso signed new trade agreements with neighboring African countries. Small but symbolic shipments of food, textiles, and medicine began moving across West African borders without reliance on Europe or the United States. For the first time in years, African nations were trading with each other on equal terms, proof that unity was not just a dream, but a practical reality. Meanwhile, foreign powers increased their pressure. News outlets owned by multinational corporations published endless stories portraying Traoré as a dictator, a dangerous populist, and even a threat to stability. Intelligence reports circulated claiming that Burkina Faso was isolated and on the verge of collapse. But reality on the ground was different. Markets were buzzing with local goods. Schools were full of young students inspired by the idea of a dignified Africa. Farmers spoke with pride about feeding their communities without foreign dependence. And above all, the people stood firmly behind their leader. One Friday evening, as thousands gathered in Ouagadougou's main square, Traoré stepped onto a simple wooden platform. He was not dressed in lavish suits or golden chains. Instead, he wore his military uniform, dusty from travel, his face marked with determination. When the crowd saw him, they erupted in chants, "Traoré, Africa, dignity." He raised his hand, and silence fell. "They told us we would collapse without them," he began, his voice echoing through the speakers. "They told us we could not breathe without their permission. They told us we would sell our dignity for a bag of money. But look around you. We are still here. Our children are learning. Our farmers are producing. Our youth are rising. And we are free." The crowd roared. Tears flowed down the faces of old men and women who had lived through decades of colonial humiliation. Young boys climbed trees to get a better view of the man who had dared to stand up when others bowed. And then his words took on a fire that will be remembered for generations. "If I fall, another will rise. If they silence me, millions will speak. Because this is not my struggle, it is Africa's struggle. And Africa cannot be bought. Not today. Not ever." Those words, captured on dozens of phones, spread across social media within minutes. Across the continent, millions watched, shared, and repeated them. In Lagos, students painted them across campus walls. In Dakar, poets wove them into verses. In Johannesburg, church leaders read them aloud to congregations. The message was unstoppable. But while the spirit of unity was spreading, the battle was far from over. Hidden hands continued to plan against Burkina Faso. Foreign lobbyists pressured African governments to distance themselves from Traoré. Economic threats loomed on the horizon. And yet, the people of Africa were no longer afraid, because something far more powerful had been born. Belief. Belief that Africa could chart its own destiny. Belief that leaders could stand tall without being puppets. Belief that dignity was worth more than dollars, and sovereignty worth more than aid. And this belief was not confined to Burkina Faso alone. From Mali to Ghana, from Uganda to South Africa, ordinary Africans began demanding the same courage from their own leaders. Traoré's defiance had lit a fire that no foreign power could extinguish. In Europe, analysts admitted privately that Africa's new consciousness would reshape the balance of power in the 21st century. In Washington, strategists debated how to approach the rising tide of African self-confidence. In Tel Aviv, officials recognized that their attempt to buy silence had achieved the exact opposite. It had awakened an entire continent, and through it all, Traoré remained steady. Not blinded by power, not tempted by wealth. He understood the risks he carried, but he also knew the truth. Africa's time had come. As the sun set over Ouagadougou that evening, painting the sky with shades of orange and red, the chants of the people echoed across the land. It was more than celebration, it was a declaration. A declaration that Africa had entered a new chapter. The struggle was not finished. The challenges were not over. But for the first time in generations, Africa stood not as a continent for sale, but as a continent of pride, unity, and strength. And this story, the story of one man rejecting a bribe and sparking a movement, will be remembered as the moment Africa chose dignity over dependency. Because some truths cannot be silenced. Some fires cannot be extinguished. And some leaders cannot be bought. And if you believe that Africa deserves leaders who stand for truth, dignity, and independence, then join us on this journey. Subscribe to our channel, share this message, and become part of the voice that says to the world, Africa is not for sale.